I'm very fortunate today to have Erika with us. Erika is going to talk about her journey related to being, I thought about it today, that they would say that Erika's a cancer survivor, but I would have to suspect that she's more of a person that's thriving related to her cancer. So I think the definition doesn't really fit. And I'm going to ask her to talk a little bit to start off about her journey, what it was like for her to be diagnosed and what she had to do to get herself through it. But it's encouraging to think that she's written a book that can explain a lot more in detail of what's going on. And I think that if you are in a situation with yourself or your family, it's a very optimistic book, and it also will provide you with tools so that you can feel that you're participating the way you need to. I was struck by the fact that the other day I was thinking about people that have chronic illness. They bring people into palliative care, which I don't think people understands. And when you define palliative care for anyone with a chronic disease, whether it's heart failure or chronic lung disease, it's really about having the best quality of life for the time that remains that we have, which I thought to myself, isn't it strange that we don't all think that way, regardless of whether we're sick or not? And I think that's what has prompted me to really reach out to Erika to try to be able to see how she evolved from what she had to go through, which these days many people have, to really being energized enough to want to get out there and talk to people about a way that they have to look at it from a viewpoint that can give them so much more in their own lives. So I'm going to turn it over to Erika a little bit and try to stay out of the way and just jump in if we need to just review or talk about something. So please, Erika, why don't you start?
Yeah, happy to. So it was 2014 when I was diagnosed in December of that year. And I had a form of breast cancer. It was clinically called, it was stage 3, HER2 positive, locally advanced invasive ductal carcinoma. And I say that only because there are so many different kinds of breast cancer, and I didn't know that before I was diagnosed. And that was one of the main things that was done at the beginning of my diagnosis, was figuring out the type, the grade, the stage, and where to go from there. And so, yes, being diagnosed was very scary. I was pretty certain before I got the diagnosis that I had cancer. I felt a lump that I noticed in a yoga class. And by the time I started my first chemo treatment, the mass was 5 centimeters wide. It's pretty big. Yeah. And so that was, part of the staging of it. It was larger than, it was right at that mark of 5 centimeters. And then it was also in my lymph nodes, and it was all on my left side. My right side was clear. And so from there, I had some time between when I discovered it and I went through all of the testing to get a diagnosis. I had about 6 weeks, maybe a little longer, to mentally prepare myself, if there is such a thing, at least to start that process. And so I had been seeing a therapist on and off before that. And so I reached out to her and told her what came up. And she said, let me come in and let's talk about this. And so I really began to deal with my mindset before I even knew for sure that a diagnosis of, positive for malignancy was coming my way. And I think that it made a big difference because, she said to me right off the bat, I'm sorry you have to deal with this. And the way she framed it in my mind felt so different from the way other people had said to me things about it. They said things like, I'm sorry you're sick. or I'm sorry that this is happening to you. And it all felt very like I didn't feel sick. I felt really healthy at that point. And I didn't like the idea of something was happening to me. It felt a very victim kind of mentality. So instead of saying that and her saying you have to deal with this, it was like, well, I can deal with this. Like I will take this one step at a time, one day at a time, just like anything else in the world. Cancer is a big deal, but not everything happens at once, and not all of the symptoms and treatments last forever. And so I just started off with a mindset of I can get through this. And I didn't ever think I was going to do it alone. I mean, obviously, the first thing I did was reach out to a therapist. And then, of course, Butch was in my life at that point. He was a primary care physician for me. And so it was very easy to, call him up and say, hey, this has happened. And what's next? And so I started with Butch early on in the process too, after my chemo began.
Well, I think it's interesting that your concept of making this day to day, just like life is, and trying to figure it out. I did have one question. Did you feel that the way it was, your diagnosis was presented to you by the person that gave you the bad news, was that something that you felt was done in a compassionate and empathetic way? Because that also sets a tone of, this is somebody that's a caring person, or this is somebody that's, it was just, here's your report. And I don't know, I don't remember how that came down.
Yeah, it was okay. It could have been better. To be honest, it was over a phone call, and the phone call lasted about a minute and a half. So as empathetic as you can be in 90 seconds, is really how that went. She wasn't, it was the radiologist who did my biopsy, who gave me the diagnosis. And she said, I'm really sorry to tell you, but to be honest, when I was having the biopsy done and the ultrasounds and all of the, mammograms and everything leading up to the diagnosis, I could just see it on everyone's face. No one said anything, but there was no like reassurance or anything like that. Everybody was like, okay, so I think the next thing we need to do is get you over for a biopsy. It was always, next steps. It wasn't, I don't think this is anything you need to worry about. There was none of that. So I already kind of knew that when I saw her and she had done my other, diagnostic testing. And so when the phone call came, she just said, hey, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but you do have a, positive biopsy. And she gave me very limited information. I did not hang up the phone knowing, the type, the grade, the stage, any of that stuff. I didn't even know those were things I should know or should ask about.
Well, that's not often what they're able to do with just a needle biopsy. It obviously requires that you have to have a removal. And so you went through that process, and you also then found an oncologist that had to discuss with you the medications you were going to be on.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I interviewed 12 doctors before I chose my 4. And that is an oncologist, a surgical oncologist, a radiation oncologist, and a reconstructive surgeon. Those were my 4. And so I interviewed 12 doctors. So I guess 3 of each of those specialties, and decided the ones that made me feel the most cared for, the ones who I had the most trust in, and who I felt were going to trust me to be a partner in my care. That was really important to me right off the bat, because some of the doctors were very dictatorial. Here's how we do this. This is what I allow, that sort of conversation. And that didn't feel right to me. It was, I wanted to feel like I was the subject and not an object. I wanted to be worked with and not worked on.
So
And
how did you know you were going to need 4 different specialists? That's a pretty sophisticated recognition that, most people go, well, okay, I got to have surgery and I got to have an oncologist, but you obviously were way ahead of it by anticipating this.
I'm lucky that I have a pathologist in my family. My nephew, who is approximately my age, he works for a big medical system in the US, and he's one of their head pathologists, and I called him. He was one of my first phone calls after I think I told my husband. I called him, and he's the one who said, well, what type is it? What grade? What stage? Have you talked to this doctor? So I had an entire list of questions from him, luckily. But yes, that is something that I don't think you often hear about. One of the ways also that it was reinforced with me is that one of the hospitals that I reached out to had I don't know what they call it. I think it's like a team approach or something where they give you 4 specialists. And I sat in a room and each specialist came in and allowed me to, they say interview them, but it was more, I felt like a commercial for their hospital. Here's all the patients we've treated. Here's how many years we've done this. Here's all the studies that we have going on. And you're a great candidate for our study. And I didn't like that feeling because it was a team that was provided to you and not anything that you really got to choose. There was no, camaraderie between us. That it was just like, there's a list of people and here's a list of patients. And I didn't like that. So that's why I continued to interview. I at first thought that would be great because I thought, hey, they're all on board. They meet once a week. They all know what, the left hand knows what the right hand is doing, etc. But it was very clinical and cold. It was detached. And it could have just been that particular hospital. I'm not sure every team approach would be that way, but this particular one was.
Well, and you certainly had a cancer that was not the typical story for most people. That most women that are fortunate enough to have receptors that are treatable by using hormone manipulation, estrogen and progesterone, and you had a unique situation where you had this epidermal growth factor.
Mhm.
Now there are chemotherapies for it, which didn't exist probably 15 years ago, 20 years ago. But it sounds like you had side effects and you were able to get through them and getting beyond the devastation of the treatment. When you
Mhm.
were finished with what they thought was going to be the treatment that they wanted to give you, how did you start picking the pieces up and start putting them back together?
Yeah. So I quickly realized that the oncologists were really focused on the cancer itself. And of course they are. That seems like an obvious statement, but they weren't even focused on the rest of my physiology. It was, did we remove the cancer? How is the breast? How is the the underarm? How are those things? But they weren't really focusing on the physiology of me and really not at all on the anatomy either. So it became necessary for me to point out and say, like, I can't do this with my arm. I'm feeling like this restriction is happening and that sort of thing. So through my own questioning, I started to find these complementary therapies that allowed me to not just heal from surgery, but to, really return for the most part to my previous state. So I had always been, a runner and a yogi. I like doing all kinds of outdoor activities, cycling and that sort of stuff. And I wanted to be able to do those things again. And so that's when I started to really concentrate on finding these professionals who would help me regain that strength, really restore what was depleted from me. Because while cancer, yes, or chemo, it did kill the cancer, but there was at least some amount of damage done to other, tissues and systems in my body. And so, working with physical therapists and massage therapists and lymphatic drainage experts and um, gosh, I think at one point I counted them all out and I had done 16 different kinds of complementary therapies. And I don't think that any one was the answer. And I don't think that any one is the right thing for an individual. But I found a mix of things that worked for me. And in that process, really started to see how much the oncology treatment I had gotten really lacked in caring for me as a whole person. I was grateful, and I still am, that the right combination of chemotherapy worked for me. I did have a complete pathologic response to the chemo when I did that first, and then when they went in and did my double mastectomy, there was no residual disease, no residual carcinoma whatsoever. And then I did radiation after that. And so I'm very grateful that those were all very successful, but I feel like there could have been some more care and concern given to me as a whole person, because we are not simply the diagnosis. We are, living, breathing beings who have an anatomy and a physiology, but also an emotional and mental state and a spirit and a soul that are very important to be kept healthy and to recover, because it's not, these are aggressive medications because they have to fight an aggressive disease. And so we can keep the body healthy while we're going through it, but also the spirit and the emotional state as well. So that, as you mentioned off the top, we're not just surviving. Surviving sounds to me like you're being nipped at the heels by these alligators under you all the time, and that's just a very stressful state to be in. But thriving was more important to me. And all I mean by thriving is just able to engage in life at the same time. And, you and I've talked a lot, Butch, about the fact that a lot of people push themselves and ignore and want to say like, oh, I just need to get through this. And sometimes, thriving is giving yourself an opportunity to rest, relax, restore, recover, and not just be like, well, I have to get back to work. I have to get back to taking care of the kids. And the dirty house will be there, and the kids are going to be fine if they warm up a can of soup again. So I think it's just a matter of prioritizing those things.
I think that's a very important part of your recovery. It's again, rather than being the victim, you're saying, I'm putting down this list of what are my essentials in order to have a life. It sounds like you have a good family life and you wanted to continue to work, but it was much more a question of being able to choose what you wanted to do when you were done. Now, when you were finished with the chemo and the radiation and the surgery, how long do you think it took you to really feel like you were then able to be at a place where you could choose if you wanted to go out for a hike, or you could choose to work for a day in your office? Did it take a long time, or did you feel it was relatively short?
I would say to feel completely recovered, it was 2 years.
Well, I would agree. I think that's something that is often misunderstood, is you're done, but you're not. You have to start. And your comments about recovering and rejuvenation are very important, because if you don't decide that whatever got me here wasn't working, I better do something different, or I'm still going to be in the same place I was beforehand. So did you see some key elements that you needed to make sure you changed?
Absolutely, Butch. I think a large part of the book that I wrote talks about that. There were so many lessons that I learned.
So
I was
tell us the name of your book.
Oh, the name of the book is Cancer and Other Things I'm Grateful For. And I'll just briefly say something about the title. I'm grateful for it because I did learn so many things in that process. I learned about myself. I learned about relationships. it was, really eye-opening for me to realize that how much of a, like a suck it up and take it kind of person I was. I was always someone who was just like, I'll just deal with it. So I don't get to sleep for 2 days. That's okay, but I'll get the thing done. I'm a type A person. I'm about accomplishment, and I just that wasn't getting me anywhere. And so this was a break. This was a big pause in my life that made me realize, like, you have to slow down and think about what's important and really prioritize those things, and savor the small things. I think I was always someone who was looking for the next thing, like, oh, summer's coming up. What are we going to do with the kids? I don't know what we're having for dinner tonight now, it's like things will fall into place and we don't always have to plan everything out. So I think that it slowed me down. I think that it gave me a perspective. I think that it allowed me to become grateful for everything that was going right at the time, because even though I was sick and in bed sometimes because the symptoms and the side effects were strong, I reminded myself to be grateful that I had a bed to lie in, that I had good doctors to count on, that I had, a husband who was downstairs taking care of things because I wasn't able to at the time. And so, it was a real opportunity for me to shift my thinking and to really become someone who can take a step back and not always react. There's an action and there's a reaction. And I feel like I was always kind of like a very on edge reactive kind of person. And I think I have been able to slow down and take things as they come and realize that nothing as bad as given a cancer diagnosis has ever happened to me before or since. And so it kind of puts into perspective the little things that happened. Even if it seems bad in the moment, you have a fender bender. Well, no one wants that, but it's perspective. And I think that it served me a big helping of perspective.
So you are how many years out now from completion of your therapy?
Let me see. I ended in 2015, so I'm 8+ years. So at the end of this year would be 9 years.
And do you feel like you've maintained, it sounds like at least, that you've maintained a lot of the perspective, again, if you're type A, I don't want to say you maintain goals, because that, that isn't a good thing. But you've been able to maintain those viewpoints of these are the important things.
Absolutely. And that actually is a big reason why I wrote my book, because when I was sick and lying in bed and thinking about all the things that I didn't know and I wish I'd known, I thought to myself, if I ever have the chance to share this information with people, I will, because there are so many things I wish I'd known. And that's, it's all out there now for people to see. And I do think that just on a daily basis, and I think my kids could probably tell you better than anyone, I'm just a lot more chill. I do still take care of myself. I'm very concerned about, potential underlying causes and, all of those kinds of things that could have led to my initial diagnosis. I guess I'm just not someone who clings so hard to things anymore. Just a little bit of a less anxious person maybe. And that is definitely stuck.
Do you feel like you've completed the therapy you needed to go
Yeah,
through?
I do. I still talk to Sally, my therapist, on occasion. Things happen in life, things pop up. I'm reminded of something, and we'll have a session via Zoom or something like that, but nothing on a regular basis. I would say in the last maybe 2-3 years, I've talked to her 2 or 3 times a year. But yes, it was intensive when I was going through it and for a while. And then it has tapered off, and I definitely feel like I know that I have the resources in me. I just have to remember to tap them and look back on the lessons I learned and apply them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you have any other thoughts that you can convey to people that might be looking at this and going, that's an optimistic view, and I think that's very helpful in terms of what I'm going through, or families. But it sounds like you really adopted a philosophy right from the beginning that determined that you were not going to be put in a situation where you had to accept what people said. You listened to what everyone said, and you made your own decisions, because ultimately you're the one that has to go through this
Yes,
and live with it. And it sounds like you made the choices for you that have worked.
absolutely. I think that if I have one thing to say to people who are going through this or have a family member who is, the number one thing to do is trust yourself. And I started to just sort of shut out all of the opinions that were swirling around me, not my medical professionals' opinions, but other people in my life, and just sort of tune in and think about how I felt about that. You know, my doctors would say you have the choice to do chemo first or surgery first. Here are the advantages and disadvantages. Well, I had to think about that, even though people were going, have surgery, you need to get that out of there. Well, that's not what I ended up doing. And so I feel like by trusting yourself, you're really holding on to your power. You're not giving that away to someone who's going to make major life decisions for you.
That is
And
very true.
you know, asking questions is the way to get there. If you don't know, if you tune in and you don't feel anything, you're like, I'm still unsure, continue to ask questions until you do have a feeling and can reach a decision. Because a good doctor will not feel challenged, or, whatever the feeling might be about you asking questions. A good doctor will be happy to answer for you what you need to know. And so asking things like, why is this necessary? And what are the advantages versus disadvantages? Those kinds of things, they should be able to explain to you in terms that make sense. And then that can help you make the decisions that you need to make.
And I think that's sometimes why, in some circumstances, writing those things down and taking someone with you, because sometimes it's just difficult to express what you want in a way that gets across. I think it's also very interesting that you have been able to embrace everything that's available. You didn't just say, I'm going to go with doctors. You didn't say, I'm just going to go with alternative stuff. You basically chose to try to find the best of each world. So you were able to take the advantages and the benefits that each could offer you. I think that's something that's lost a lot, that there is no one way that necessarily is the only way, but certainly being smart enough to know that you need everyone.
Yeah.
It's just at what level you want them and how well they work for you. And it sounds like you did a lot of that. You had to really look around to find all the different things that were available.
I did have to look around a lot, and luckily I lived in an area where there was a lot available. I was in Denver, Colorado at the time, and it's a big city with a lot of different healthcare opportunities, and so finding the professionals that I needed, it wasn't that hard. It might be in some other areas, but I still feel like it's worth the investigation to find people who can really give you that complementary care, because you're right. I didn't want to just say, I don't want to do XYZ. It was like, I want to do this and that, it's sort of not the tyranny of the or, but the bliss of the and, it was this and that. I didn't have to suffer. I didn't have to say like, well, I'm doing chemo, therefore I'm stuck with all the side effects. That wasn't where my mind went. So I decided that I wanted to be as healthy as I could be in the process and engage with my life as much as I could while I was dealing with the disease.
And even after.
And
It sounds like you've been doing that. I think that
still,
I've had an opportunity to read your book. I think it's something that is very both informational and enlightening. It presents things that people need to know, but it presents them from a viewpoint of how you utilize them. So people, it's not just a list of, well, you need to go to an occupational therapist and you go to a nutritionist, but more a question of what it is that you did and why you did it. And it sounds like the overall outcome was exactly what you wanted.
absolutely. Sally asked me that at one of my last in-person sessions with her. Do you have any regrets about your treatment? And I said, I don't. I mean, I feel in my bones that I did everything I could, and I'm happy with the choices I made and the doctors and the caregivers. And the only thing I would change is that I wish the entire medical system provided some more of an umbrella of care for patients so that when they start down the road of needing oncology care, they don't have to do what I did. They don't have to piece it together. They don't have to wonder what could help me with this issue I'm having. It would be presented to them and be handled by someone in charge who knows what all the pieces are. And instead, I had to come to my doctors and say, I'm doing this. Is that okay with this other thing? And some of the doctors were more receptive than others, but that would be my one wish, is that the US healthcare system would treat patients, and not just oncology patients. I mean, of course, that's what my experience was, but every patient going through a major challenge, to look at them as a whole person and treat everything.
It's a great goal. It's definitely a very fractured system in terms of separation of being able to pull all those things together. But it
Right.
certainly, it appears more that individuals are speaking out about it and also doing something about it. And it's people like you that say, I did this. And your book explains a lot of the things you did. So there's a lot of information that people can use to do it themselves. And I think that's something that is to be commended. And I think that you have anything further to add to our visit today?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that's the last thing I want to say is, while you might be in pain, you don't have to suffer. And so just remember that, you can find people that can help you, and you don't have to suffer through the process.
Well, that certainly would make it a lot easier to go through the process, knowing that and that's the other thing, you found things that could relieve the symptoms and the discomfort and the disfigurement and the things that were happening to you. So those things exist. It's
Yeah.
not like you were, beating your head against the wall. You actually, by looking for it, found what really would work. And that's probably part of it, is that people have to recognize that it's there if they really can look for it and want to do it.
Yes, it is a flawed system, but that doesn't mean that we can't try to make the best of it. Well, this is the system we have.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Butch.